Have Yourself a Scary Little Christmas, a Ghostly Fashionista short story by Gail Leeson.
Hello, darling. I'm sorry you can't see me. But as they say in all the romances, it's not you, it's me. In this case, it really is me. I'm a ghost. My friend Amanda Tucker calls me the Ghostly Fashionista. We both adore clothes. In fact, she sews them right here in this delightful boutique, which used to be my living room. I don't want to go into too much detail about all that, though. I'd simply like to introduce myself and then get on with my story. You see, Amanda is usually the one who relays our adventures to you. So, my name is Maxine Engelbright, but I go by Max. I fell down that staircase out there in the hallway and broke my stupid neck in 1930. Be careful and hold to the railing if you go up or down those stairs. Trust me on that. Amanda is one of a handful of people who is able to see and hear me. You might not think a ghost and a young living woman could be best friends, but we are. Anyway, sit back, relax, and let me tell you my spooky tale. Chapter 1. Decorating at the Boutique. Amanda was fluttering around the lobby of the boutique in a green velvet A-line dress with a portrait collar. She and my great-niece Zoe, resplendent in jeans torn at the knee and a white shaker-knit sweater, were hanging a garland over the mantel. Amanda's grandfather, Dave, a handsome man I often called a silver fox, and my nephew Dwight, Zoe's granddad, who was so like my sister in looks and demeanor, were putting the pre-lit tree together in front of the main window. Jasmine, or Jazzy, Amanda's gray and white tabby, pounced on a beam of light created by the waning sun glinting off a strand of tinsel. I perched slightly above the desk and delighted in the scene before me. Watching the people I love decorating for Christmas really takes me back, I said. Tell us about some of your traditions, Aunt Max, Zoe said. Clasping my hands together, I said, well, for one thing, we never decorated the tree until Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve? Amanda turned to me, her brows drawn together in dismay. That's terrible. You had hardly any time to enjoy it. I laughed. We enjoyed it well enough, darling. We had more fun spending the evenings leading up to our tree trimming party, making ornaments, paper chains, string snowflakes, popcorn garlands. Mother insisted on upholding her grandmother's tradition of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, so we did that as we worked practicing up for the main event, I suppose. Ghost stories on Christmas Eve? Dave shook his head. That's a new one on me, and I thought I'd been around long enough to have heard of everything. Amanda grinned at him. See? I told you you're not as old as you think. I remember the ghost stories, Dwight said. Mom kept it going with us kids. We had to do ours before Dad came home. He didn't think ghost stories had any place in Christmas celebrations. I kinda see his point, Zoe said. Telling scary stories on Christmas doesn't make a lot of sense. Charles Dickens would beg to differ, I said. That's right. Amanda turned to take some red ribbon from a cardboard box. The ghost story tradition is English, isn't it? It is. Granny was born here, but she clung to her English heritage as if we were members of the royal family. I laughed. Granny was a hoot. You would have loved her. Tell us one of your stories, Zoe said. Well, that's the thing, love, I said. We didn't know very many and didn't have a great deal of talent for making them up. So Daddy often told us stories from his childhood. Do you think Granddad ever stretched the truth? Dwight chuckled. I used to think he was king of the tall tales. As did I. Until one Christmas Eve. Chapter 2, Back in Time. Dorothy, Maxine, you're eating more popcorn than you're putting on the string. Mother clucked her tongue. We'll have the most pitiful-looking tree in the neighborhood if you two keep going at that rate. But you'll have the happiest girls, I said, winking at my younger sister. Dot giggled. We can't help that it's so good. She and I were in our mid to late teens that year, but our exact ages escaped me upon telling this story. Suffice it to say that Dot and I were young, beautiful, and not lacking in mischief. All of us brightened when Daddy came home. Even Mother, who leaned more toward the serious side of life. Daddy hugged Mother and kissed her cheek. And what have my beauties been doing today? Shaking her head, Mother said, This one has been trying to keep those two from eating all our Christmas tree decorations. Ah, let them have at it. He wedged himself between Dot and me on the burgundy sofa. If they run out of decorations, they can eat the tree. There'll be more dinner for us if they're full. Putting an arm around each of us, he gave us a squeeze. Have you had a good day, Daddy? I asked. Every day is a good day, sweetheart. I'm the most blessed man in the world. Tell us a story while Mother finishes dinner, Dot said. Shouldn't the two of you be helping with that? He asked. We did our part. I peeled and diced potatoes while Dot pulled carrot duty. I held up my hands. Look, I've worked my fingers to the bone. Me too. Dot held her hands out for his examination. They're spoiled, Mother called from the kitchen. But keep them in there. I don't want them in here under my feet. You heard her. I snuggled against Daddy's shoulder and inhaled the faint scent of wood smoke that lingered on his clothes. Now you can tell us that story. Yes, Daddy. Tell about Freddie and the haunted house. I was saving that one for Christmas Eve, he said. You can tell it again and it will be every bit as good, I said. We never get tired of hearing that one. He gave a low, growly groan and then smiled. All right, then. Chapter 3, Daddy's Story. Freddie and I weren't the most well-behaved lads, but we weren't all that bad. I suppose you might say the two of us were simply left to our own devices more often than we should have been. When we were around the ages you girls are now, he and I loved playing hide-and-seek in the woods near the haunted house on summer evenings. In fact, on this particular moonless night with the occasional flicker of heat, lightning splitting the sky and a whiff of rain on the breezes, we decided to use the haunted house as home base. We flipped a penny to see who'd hide first, and Freddie won. That suited me fine. I went to the big maple tree, hid my eyes, and began counting. We were supposed to count to 100, but I never counted past 20, and I knew good and well Freddie didn't either. He couldn't have, given how quickly he always yelled, "Ready or not, here I come!" So I counted my measly amount, yelled "ready or not," and moseyed on down toward the haunted house. My plan was to hide in the bushes and give Freddie a hearty scare when he approached the house. You see, I'd heard the same stories everyone else had, but I thought it was all a lot of hooey. Just because what once had been a nice big house was now abandoned and dilapidated, and simply because it sat out in the middle of nowhere didn't make it haunted. To me, the house was sad. I could imagine a family gather it around the fire telling stories like we are now, laughter, music, life filling its rooms. I wondered what had really happened to the family who'd once occupied and loved the old house. I know you want to hear a ghost story. So, here is the one that was told about the house. Just after the Civil War ended, because, as you know, most good Southern ghost stories have their roots in the Civil War, two brothers came home to Virginia. One had fought for the North and the other for the South, but they both believed they were returning home to marry the lovely blue-eyed Bess. Now, mind you, Bess wasn't promised to either man, but they were both in love with her. That fateful night, they met at Bess's home, what was currently known as the haunted house by chance. Each man intended to declare his love for Bess and ask for her hand in marriage. How furious the two men were to see each other. Instead of being happy that his brother was alive, instead of embracing his brother in the spirit of forgiveness and a willingness to put an end to their years of strife, each soldier drew his sword. Instead of asking Bess if she even wanted either of them, they began to fight for her. Bess cared for both brothers, and the last thing she wanted was for either of them to shed a single drop of blood on her account. She ran down the front porch steps with her arms open wide, pleading for the brothers to put down their swords. But the men were focused on their hate rather than on their love. Both expert swordsmen, neither could inflict a killing blow against the other. It wasn't until blue-eyed Bess crumpled to the ground that the men realized one of their swords had dealt a fatal blow. Legend had it that on moonless nights, such as the one on which I planned to scare the hair off Freddie's head, you could hear blue-eyed Bess weeping. Some versions of the ghost story added that you could see Bess standing at the window, or the brothers fighting on the lawn. I knew the whole tale was a load of hooey. But I thought Freddie wasn't so sure. I hid behind a holly bush and debated the various techniques I could use to spring out at my unsuspecting friend. Turns out the joke was on me. Not 10 minutes after I squatted down behind that holly bush, I heard two men commence fighting. I took off like Snyder's hound on a rabbit's trail and never looked back. As soon as I got home, I felt like an idiot. Either Freddie had pranked me, or there simply happened to be two men walking in the woods having an argument near where I'd been hiding. Shamefaced, I went around to Freddie's house the next morning. He wasn't there. He hadn't come home last night. Worse still, I never saw Freddie again. Chapter 4. Christmas Eve. Well, I probably don't need to tell you how we two emotional teens wept for poor blue-eyed Bess and for Freddie. We had so many questions for which there were no answers. Which brother would Bess have chosen if either? What if she'd already married someone else by the time they came back from the war? Was it the pair of phantom brothers Daddy had heard arguing? Had they stabbed Freddie with their swords? Could they stab Freddie? Or had Freddie seen the apparitions and died of fright? What if the men Daddy had heard arguing weren't ghosts at all, but were bad men who'd kidnapped Freddie? We guessed we'd never know what became of poor Freddie, but we were wrong. On that Christmas Eve, the very evening after Daddy had entertained us with Freddie's sad story, there was a knock on the door. Expecting carolers, all four of us went to answer it. But rather than carolers, it was a short, thin man who had his fedora pulled way down over his eyes and his coat turned up at the collar. Beside him stood a platinum blonde woman wearing a full-length white fur coat. She had the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. When he saw Dot and me, the man tipped up the brim of his hat and said, "Hello, ladies. I'm an old friend of your daddy's. You can call me Freddie." Dot gasped and looked at the woman. "Are you Blue-Eyed Bess?" The woman grinned. "No, sugar. I'm Mavis. Who's Blue-Eyed Bess?" "A ghost," Dot whispered. Freddie threw back his head and laughed. "Been telling him about our childhood, eh?" I turned my attention to Daddy, who looked like he was about to be sick. I didn't want Daddy to be upset. He had to know that whatever had happened to Freddie wasn't his fault. "Where have you been all this time?" I asked Freddie. "What happened to you that night in the woods?" "Maxine, shh." Mother's shh emerged as a hiss, but that poor woman never was able to rein me in. "Are you all coming in or what?" I asked. "Sassy, I like that." Freddie doffed his hat. "We'd be much obliged." Dot and I moved aside, but Mother and Daddy seemed to have sprouted roots right there in the foyer. I glanced at Mother as Freddie and Mavis handed me their coats. Although she was staring at me, she didn't appear to be angry. She was frightened. That was my first inkling that the story about Freddie's disappearance might not have occurred exactly as Daddy had told it. A lump formed in my throat as I took the coats and hung them in the hall closet. "Freddie, I heard you'd moved up north," Daddy was saying when I returned to the living room. Mavis and Freddie were sitting on the burgundy sofa, Dot perched on the piano bench, and Mother and Daddy had remained sitting. "Did you now?" Freddie leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees, and steepled his fingers. "Beautiful family you've got here. You've done well for yourself." "Thanks." Daddy's voice was flat. I found it odd that he didn't introduce any of us to Freddie, but I knew there had to be a good reason. "Girls, go upstairs," Mother said. Dot was watching me to see what I'd do. I left the living room, and she got up and trailed after me. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped but stamped my feet as if I was still climbing the staircase. Grinning, Dot followed suit. I was such a bad influence. We crouched on the stairs and listened. The adults were talking quietly, so we only caught a phrase here and there. "Be a pal," Freddie was saying, "for old time's sake." "I can't keep that thing here," Daddy said. "You want me to—" Freddie's next words were unintelligible. Then his voice rose. "Listen, you owe me. I'm not asking you to keep it forever. Just till—" "Until what?" Daddy asked. "Until the police come here and haul me away?" Dot and I stared at each other open-mouthed. You think I'd let that happen? You think I'd set you up as a stool pigeon? I couldn't hear Daddy's response to Freddie's question, but I knew for sure I wouldn't stand by and let Daddy be taken to jail. You owe me, Freddie repeated. 48 hours, Daddy said. After that, you come back here and get it. It's a deal, Freddie said. I'll get your coats, Mother said. Dot grabbed my arm. I slipped off my shoes and she followed suit. We crept on up the stairs. In our room, Dot was wringing her hands. What are we gonna do? I don't know yet. We don't have all the facts. A few minutes after Freddie and Mavis left, Daddy called us back downstairs. Our guilt over eavesdropping was likely written all over our faces. I would like to think I could feign innocence slightly better than my baby sister, who at the moment was being more dramatic than Clara Bow. Have your friends left already, Daddy? She asked. You know very well they have, Mother said. You and your sister were spying from the staircase. How did you know? Dot huffed. We pretended to go all the way up the stairs and everything. I merely pinched the bridge of my nose and looked down at the floor. There was still much I needed to teach that child, mainly to keep your mouth shut when you're guilty. It doesn't matter, Daddy said. Good old Daddy. I owe you girls an explanation, he continued. Talk while we trim the tree, Mother said. It is Christmas Eve after all. Mother always had to be busy when she was nervous. Her being nervous made me nervous, but I was too intrigued by whatever Daddy was about to say to show it. Picking up a popcorn garland, I said, See, Mother? Dot and I didn't eat all of it. Go on, Daddy. As you guessed right away, that was Freddie from the story I've told you for as long as I can remember, he said. Yeah, but I'm awfully disappointed that the dame with him wasn't Blue-Eyed Bess, Dot said. Young woman, not dame? Mother rolled her eyes heavenward. Do you think we're in the midst of a Dickens tale, being visited by the ghost of Christmas past or something? I gave a little laugh. You'll never know if you don't hush and let your daddy speak. Mother snatched up a paper chain and wound it through the branches of the tree. Daddy lit a pipe before telling us about Freddie. He seldom smoked, so I knew he was as uneasy as Mother, maybe more so. I'll never forget the smell of the living room that evening. It was perfect. Pine, popcorn, cherry tobacco, and a hint of vanilla because Mother had been baking all afternoon. I almost didn't want Daddy to tell us the truth about Freddie, or why he'd been here, or what Daddy had agreed to keep for him for 48 hours. If he didn't tell us, maybe we could pretend it had never happened, and tonight could still be wonderful. I didn't lie. Daddy puffed on his pipe as he walked around the room. I embellished. I didn't see Freddie again after that night of hide-and-seek, but I heard what had happened to him. The men I'd heard arguing were two flesh-and-blood brothers, not phantoms. Did they kidnap Freddie? Dot asked. Mother glared at her for interrupting, and she returned to tying ornaments on the tree. He wasn't kidnapped, but one of the men had seen Freddie around, knew Freddie's dad or some such. Anyway, he put Freddie to work that very night. Dot opened her mouth to speak again, caught Mother's scowl, and wisely clamped her lips together. The men were criminals. I heard they used Freddie as their lookout at first, but he worked his way up through the ranks, I suppose. He did appear to be enjoying a measure of success. He looked like a rat caught in a maze to me. Mother hung a crocheted cross on the tree. Freddie came here tonight to ask me for help, Daddy said. He's found himself in a bit of trouble. What kind of trouble? Dot asked. Never you mind, Mother told her. Your daddy agreed to help him just this once. He'll be back day after tomorrow, and I'd better not catch hide nor hair of either of you while he's here. Yes, ma'am. Dot looked at me, and I gave her a little shrug. Let's not dwell on unpleasantness. Daddy took the angel ornament from Mother's hand. Play us some Christmas carols, won't you, love? The girls and I can finish the tree. Mother went to the piano, and soon we were all singing and laughing and enjoying ourselves. We put Freddie and Mavis out of our minds. In fact, I didn't give either of them another thought until I saw the morning newspaper on December 26th. Freddie and Mavis had been shot to death on Christmas Eve hours after leaving our home. Chapter 5. The Smoking Gun. Daddy, have you seen this? He and I were alone in the kitchen, and the newspaper was lying between us. Mother and Dot were still sleeping. I was staring at the headline slack-jawed while Daddy stared into the coffee mug between his hands. Placing my hand on his arm, I said, "Talk to me. What was going on with Freddie?" "Max." He shook his head. "You know I'm the only one you can talk this out with. Mother and Dot would go all to pieces." "You underestimate them." He sighed. "When he came here on Christmas Eve, Freddie gave me a gun wrapped in brown paper and bound with twine. It has his boss's fingerprints on it. I'm guessing the gun was used to commit a crime?" "A murder," he said, "of a policeman." "Did the boss ask Freddie to get rid of the gun or something?" "I suppose so, but Freddie wanted out of the organization and chose to use the gun to blackmail the boss into letting him go." I groaned. That wasn't terribly bright. "No." He nodded toward the newspaper. "You see where that got him. Poor Freddie. He wanted an honest life with Mavis, but didn't know how to go about getting it." "Why come to you? The two of you had fallen out of touch." "That's why. Freddie didn't think any of his boss's lackeys would think to look for him here." "Did he ask you to hide him here?" I asked. "No. He knew better. I'd never risk my family's lives for anyone." I gave his arm a squeeze. "What did he hope to gain by leaving the gun here?" "Well, naturally, the boss wants the gun back. Freddie figured that if he was caught but didn't have the gun with him, he and Mavis would be safe until he worked out a deal with the boss." "But the boss wasn't negotiating." "Obviously not." He looked at me. "I'm frightened. Not for me, but for the rest of you. This gun I foolishly agreed to hide for Freddie cost him and Mavis their lives. Their killers could come for us next." I stiffened. "You think they know he came here? To our house?" "I don't know what they know. The newspaper said Freddie and Mavis were from Chicago and were believed to have been in town visiting family for the holidays." He sipped the coffee and grimaced. It had apparently grown cold. "I want you, Dot, and your mother to leave and—" "No." I quickly glanced around to make sure Mother or Dot wasn't coming down the stairs and had heard my outburst. Lowering my voice, I went on. "Send them away if you want to, but there's no way I'll leave you here alone at the mercy of some goons." "I got myself into this predicament, Maxine. I'll get myself out of it." "You did not get yourself into it. Freddie got you into it. Why did he keep saying you owed him anyway?" "Nah, because I left him in the woods that night and the criminals recruited him. Had I not left him, he wouldn't have gotten involved in— Oh, please, nobody's buying that. He stayed because he wanted to." I tipped his coffee cup onto the newspaper. "Max." "Oops." Gathering up the coffee-soaked newspaper, I said, "Here's what we're going to do." I wadded the paper up and threw it into the garbage can. Mother and Dot don't need to know what happened to Freddie and Mavis. If anyone should ever mention them or their deaths to us, we'll act as shocked as anyone would be to hear of their deaths. We have no newspaper this morning because of clumsy me, and we won't get a replacement." Dad put his hand over his mouth. Looking back, I'm certain he was trying to hide a grin at my trying to control the situation. "Sweetheart, we can't simply pretend none of this ever happened." "True, but we can't live in fear of something that might never happen either. If you send Mother, Dot, and me away, it's going to look suspicious to anyone would might have been following Freddie." "That's a good point." "It's an excellent point." I brought him some fresh coffee, wiped off the table, and kissed the top of his head. "You're raising a genius, you know. I'm going to make breakfast now, and we're going to enjoy ourselves until someone gives us reason not to." That reason came sooner than I was expecting. We were sitting at the dining room table playing Parcheesi when there was a knock at the front door. Daddy and I exchanged glances. "I'll get it," I said. "Nope." He kept his tone light, but I could hear the vein of steel in it. "Your turn is coming next. I'll go." I didn't want him to. What if he opened the door and got shot? Let's not answer it. We're having such fun. He ignored me and went to the door. I clenched my fists beneath the table as Mother moved her game piece around the board. "Mrs. Collins!" Dad exclaimed loudly. "What a nice surprise!" As I deflated in relief, Mother said under her breath, "Ugh, let's go and be sociable if we must. Maxine, it's your turn when we get back." Mother didn't care for Mrs. Collins. She said the woman was a busybody. I wasn't crazy about her either, but I was delighted she was the person at the door. When Dot, Mother, and I joined Daddy and Mrs. Collins in the living room, there was a man with them. My eyes widened and flew to Daddy. "Ladies, this is Mrs. Collins's son, James, who is home for the holidays," Daddy said. Sizing up James, I asked, "Why have we never met you before, James? We've lived next to your mother for years." James, a ham-fisted palooka with slicked back hair, said, "It was only thanks to a Christmas bonus my new employer gave me that I was able to come visit Mom at last. Some of us aren't as fortunate as others." "What others?" I asked. "Maxine, don't be rude," Mother said. "It's all right," James said. "It's simply that we couldn't help but stare at the visitors you had on Christmas Eve." "They were ever so elegant," Mrs. Collins said. "Were they relatives?" "No," Daddy smiled. "The man was someone I grew up with. I hadn't seen him for nearly 3 decades. "They didn't stay long," James said. "The nosy apple didn't fall far from the tree." "They did not," Daddy said. "It became obvious quickly that apart from reliving a few childhood memories, the two of us had little to talk about." "That's often the case with old friends, isn't it?" Mother smiled. "You realize you don't know each other at all anymore. Would you like some coffee or tea?" "I'd love a cup of coffee," Mrs. Collins said. "Nothing for me, thanks." James looked around the room. "Nice place you've got here?" Daddy thanked him as Mother went to get Mrs. Collins coffee. The clock's ticking seemed so loud as I wondered if Mrs. Collins had recognized our Christmas Eve visitors as the murder victims in this morning's newspaper. Should we have told Mother and Dot about their deaths? Was Mrs. Collins or her son going to ask about that next? "Where do you live, James?" Dot asked. "Up north." "It must be hard not to get to come home and visit your mother often," she said. "I'd be heartsick if I had to go years without seeing my family." "It is difficult," he said, "but I'm here now." "What do you do up north?" I asked. "I work in a factory." Mother returned and handed Mrs. Collins a cup of coffee on a matching saucer. "Are you sure you won't have anything, James?" "Positive. You know, it's odd an old friend coming to visit you out of the blue like that. Did he let you know ahead of time he planned to drop in?" "No, I didn't even realize he knew where I lived," Daddy said. "How about that?" James shook his head. "I didn't see any resemblance between him and Mrs. Collins. Of course, he could be the spitting image of the late Mr. Collins for all I knew." Dot opened her mouth to speak, and I was terrified she was about to entertain Mrs. Collins and her son with the haunted house story. "Dot," I said quickly, "why don't you play that new song you learned?" "Oh, please do," Mrs. Collins said. "I'd love to hear it." Okay." Slightly frowning at me, Dot moved to the piano bench and began to play. She played with deliberation and nervous tension. It suited the mood in the room perfectly, as far as I was concerned. James got up and moved closer to the fireplace. "Are you cold?" I asked, going to stand beside him. "No, dear. I suffer back pain from an old injury." He smiled down at me. "I'm unable to sit for too long at a time." "I'm sorry to hear that. May I get you a pillow or something?" "No, thank you. I'll be fine in a bit." After Dot finished her song, Mrs. Collins requested her to play Silent Night. "I'm afraid I don't know that one," Dot said. "But Mother does." Mrs. Collins didn't have to twist Mother's arm, and it was at least half an hour before the playing of Christmas carols ended. At that point, James said, "Mother, I feel we've imposed on these good people long enough." Mother and Daddy made the requisite polite protestations, but we were all relieved when they were gone. "What did you ask that man when you went to stand with him by the fireplace, Maxine?" Mother asked as we sat back down to our game of Parcheesi. I told her and then picked up the dice. "I didn't like the looks of that guy. I felt like maybe he was snooping around where he had no business." Mother clucked her tongue. "You're always suspicious of people." "Better suspicious than naive." I rolled a 4. "Weren't Freddie and Mavis supposed to come back today?" Dot asked. "They were," Daddy said. "I imagine something came up." He gave a hollow-sounding chuckle. "That's Freddie, though. Always was one to flit from one thing to the next." Chapter 6. On the second day after Christmas. I came downstairs the following morning to find both Mother and Daddy in the kitchen. Daddy had the week off from work, and I was glad of that. I didn't want him out of my sight until I felt confident that this Freddie business was behind us. Wanting to speak with Daddy alone, I said, "Mother, why don't you go play us something and I'll make breakfast?" She was a hard nut to crack, and she probably figured I was up to something. "I've already got biscuits in the oven, and I'd prefer not to wake your sister until they're done. If you'd prefer to speak with your father alone, the two of you may go to the living room." "There's no need, Max," Daddy said. "She knows." "How?" I asked. "A double homicide in our town isn't so common that the newspaper wouldn't carry the story 2 days in a row," she said, "especially when the killer or killers remain at large." Huffing out a breath, I said, "Well, for goodness sake, don't tell Dot." "What did you want to talk with me about in particular?" Daddy asked. "The gun." I sat at the table beside him. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to turn it in to the police," he said. "You can't." "Why can't he?" Mother asked. "We've been sitting here discussing it, and it's the most reasonable solution." "No, it's not," I said. "Freddie ditched the thing here thinking his not having it with him would keep him and Mavis safe. But it didn't. If Daddy leaves here with that gun, he might end up like them." I looked from Mother to Daddy. "Don't you see? The shooter thought one of them was carrying the gun. Now they're dead, and their killer still doesn't have the gun. People know they were here. If you leave—" I broke off, unable to continue. He covered my hand with his. "What do you suggest, sweetheart?" "Call the police and ask them to come here." Mother stood and went to the oven to check the biscuits. "I don't know. The police are trying to solve this case quickly in order to reassure the townspeople that there's not a madman on the loose. Some ambitious young officer wanting to make a name for himself could come here, make your father look guilty, and arrest him." "Okay, then I'll take the gun to the police station." Both parents bristled at my suggestion. "It makes perfect sense," I said. "I can deliver the package, say I found it in the street or something, and—" "Why are you afraid for me to leave the house with the gun but believe it's a fine idea for you to do so?" Daddy asked. "I'm an innocent young lady, Daddy. Neither the murderer nor the police will think I'm up to anything." I batted my eyes. "Innocent. My Aunt Fanny." Mother slipped on oven mitts and removed the pan of biscuits from the oven. "We'll discuss this after breakfast. I'm going upstairs to wake your sister." When I heard Mother climbing the stairs, I told Daddy, "You know I'm right." "Let me think on it." Our breakfast was interrupted by a knock at the door. "I'll get it." Mother's glare dared any of us to contradict her. While Dot happily ate her biscuit and jam, Daddy and I locked gazes and streamlined our ears to hear what was happening at the front door. I, for one, couldn't hear a thing. Mother returned momentarily, said the visitor was collecting for the Widows and Orphans Fund, and asked Daddy for some money. As he took out his wallet, I asked Mother, "Have you ever seen this person before?" She rolled her eyes. "No, Maxine, but—" Before she could finish her sentence, I was out of my chair and on my way to the foyer. There stood an old woman who was a head shorter than I was and at least 20 pounds lighter. I could see why Mother didn't find her threatening. "Hi there," I said. "Mother is getting you some money for the—" "What organization did you say you're with again?" "The Abingdon Women's League," she said. "We're collecting for the Widows and Orphans Fund." "Interesting. I'd have thought you'd do that before Christmas rather than after." Giving me a thin smile, she said, "We depleted the fund before the holidays, making distributions to those in need. Now we have to build it back up." Mother arrived and handed the woman a couple of bills. "Of course." She shot an angry glance in my direction before asking the woman if she'd like a cup of coffee to warm her before she went back out into the cold. "No, thank you. I appreciate your hospitality and your donation." She left, and Mother and I returned to the kitchen. "Aren't you ashamed for giving that poor old lady the 3rd degree?" she asked me. "Absolutely not. I merely don't want our family to be snookered." "I'm grateful we have you looking out for us," she said. "Heaven knows the adults in this family aren't as wise and worldly as you are." "That's not—" "Sit down and finish your breakfast." Her tone left no room for argument. "Yes, ma'am." I sat down at the table and tore off a piece of the biscuit I'd been eating. I didn't want it now, but I put the bread into my mouth to keep Mother from accusing me of being wasteful or unappreciative. Following breakfast, I went upstairs and took one of my favorite dresses from the wardrobe. I still had every intention of going to the police department, even though I wasn't sure Mother and Daddy would allow me to go. Maybe I could suggest taking Dot along. It was as if she knew I was thinking about her because the little imp barged into my room and plopped onto my bed. "What's up with you?" I shrugged. "What's up with you?" "Come on. We don't hide things from each other, and you've been acting weird since yesterday morning." "Have I?" "Max, tell me. I know it has something to do with Freddie and Mavis. I overheard Mother and Daddy talking about them. They're dead, aren't they?" I sat on the bed beside her and took her hand. "It's nothing to do with us." "But it is. The person who killed them might come looking for us. That's what you're afraid of, isn't it? That's why the 3 of you tense up whenever you hear a noise outside?" Running my free hand over her hair, I seriously considered lying to her. But she was right. We didn't hide things from each other, and we didn't lie to each other. As desperately as I wanted to protect my baby sister, I didn't want to lose her trust. "Yes," I said at last. "It is." I told her everything I knew, up to and including my plan to have Daddy hand over the gun for me to take to the police station. "I'll go with you," she said. I nodded. 2 innocent young ladies walking down the street are more inconspicuous than one. She grinned. "Or 1 innocent young lady and 1 know-it-all." "All right, Mother, go get dressed." She was laughing when she left my room. I wondered if her laughter was hiding a fit of nerves. My insides certainly felt as if they were turning to jelly. I'd be so relieved when we got that gun out of our house. Chapter 7. Gumshoes, sugar cookies, and things that go bump in the night. I heard voices as I descended the stairs. Mother's, Daddy's, and a deep, unfamiliar baritone. I quickened my pace. In the living room, I found my parents with a man of about 40 years of age. He was wearing a brown suit beneath a tan overcoat. Had Mother not offered to take the man's coat? Or had he refused to take it off? Maybe he was hiding something. "Maxine, this is Detective Sharp with the Federal Police," Daddy said. "That's swell," I said. "What a fancy badge you must have. May I see it?" "Not at the moment. I'm discussing serious business with your parents." "Run on back upstairs." Daddy jerked his head slightly toward the doorway. "I'll be up in a little bit." "All right." I hurried up the steps as Dot was emerging from her room. "What's going on?" she asked. There's some gumshoe in the living room claiming to be a Fed. Let's go to the top of the stairs and listen. I caught her arm before she could dart past me. No, Daddy said he'll be up here to talk to us in a few minutes. Daddy or the Fed? Daddy, I said. Do you think the guy really is a Fed, or is he an imposter? I don't know. I sat on the edge of her bed. He wouldn't show me his badge. That's a sure sign he's a fake, she said. Either way, Daddy won't be fooled. I have confidence in him. And Mother, too, for that matter. In fact, I didn't have as much confidence in either of them as I pretended to have. I just prayed they'd be all right. Looking back, I had to admit I was pretty full of myself in those days. Once the detective left, Daddy found Dot and me still in her room. She knows everything, I told him. She heard you and Mother talking, and I filled her in on the rest. That's good, Daddy said. We should all be aware of what's going on. Was the man downstairs a real Fed? Dot asked, hopping off the bed. Or was he a phony? I'm not sure. Let's go to the kitchen and discuss it over cocoa. Mother was already in the kitchen heating the milk in a saucepan. As she added cocoa powder and sugar, she asked Dot if she'd like to stir. Dot, who was keen on perfecting her cooking skills, gave her an enthusiastic yes. I never cared for cooking, but I did enjoy cocoa and was appreciative of anyone willing to make me some. You said you weren't sure if the gumshoe was really who he claimed to be, I said. Why not? I feel that under the circumstances, we need to exercise an abundance of caution with anyone and everyone, Daddy said. He told us he was retracing the actions of Freddie and Mavis on the night they were murdered and that he knew they'd been here. How did he know that if he wasn't following them or something in the first place? Dot asked. Good point, I said. Did he mention how he knew? No, but I didn't ask either. He folded his hands. Instead, I said yes. Freddie was an old friend that I hadn't seen since we were in school together. I explained that Freddie had moved away and we lost touch. He dropped by to introduce us to Mavis. Did he try to accuse you of anything, Daddy? Dot asked. No. He asked if I knew where Freddie and Mavis were going after they left here, and I said I imagined they were headed to his mother's house. That is where he told us they were going, Mother said. The police officer said they never got there and asked if I'd seen the account of their deaths in the paper. He scratched his head. I admitted that I had. The man acted as if he wanted to keep pushing but knew he didn't have a reason for doing so. Mother turned off the stove and poured the cocoa into 4 mugs. He wanted to know if Freddie said anything unusual. Did he talk about his work? Did he mention any of his associates, that sort of thing? Your daddy said of course not. Why would Freddie discuss any of that with him? The only thing I did say was that Freddie talked about settling down and marrying Mavis, Daddy said. And that was true. Did he show you his badge? I asked. Briefly. It looked real, though. He lowered his voice as if the detective might be outside with an ear to the wall. We didn't mention the gun. We found it suspicious that he came to us without our even calling the police. Tomorrow morning, we'll go out the entire family for a walk. We'll drop the gun on the ground near the police station if we can do it without being seen. I have a better idea, Mother said. Dot and I will make sugar cookies to take to the police station. While we're there, you can nonchalantly place the gun where it's sure to be found. We'll be rid of it, and if anyone is watching us, they'll know we've gone to the police. That should get us out of the soup all the way around. What an excellent idea, love. Daddy lifted his mug in a salute. Fancy a game of chess while those two are baking? I asked. You're on. We had a solid plan and could finally relax and enjoy ourselves for the first time in 2 days. This nightmare was close to being over. That night, as I was on the precipice of sleep, I heard a light tap and then my door creaking open. Knowing before even hearing her voice that it was Dot, I whispered, "What's the matter?" "I can't sleep." I threw back the covers so she could get into bed with me. "Of course you can't sleep. You're up wandering around the house." "It's not that," she said, sliding in beside me. I keep thinking I hear something downstairs. You're apprehensive about tomorrow, that's all. I am too. But I stopped speaking because I heard something too. Raising my index finger to my lips, I got out of bed and crept to the door. Dot was right on my heels. We tiptoed down the hall to Mother and Daddy's room. I reached for the doorknob, but the door opened. Gasping, I jumped back, knocking into Dot. She righted herself as Daddy came out of the room. "Have you two been downstairs?" he whispered. I shook my head. "We heard something too. Go in there and stay with your mother. Close and lock the door. Don't open it until I say so." "I'm going with you," I said. "You are not. Now is not the time for your stubbornness." "Then you stay with us." I threw my arms around him. "If somebody is here for that dumb gun, then let 'em have it." He kissed the top of my head. "Stay with your mother and Dot. I'm counting on you to keep them safe." He knew that would get me. I did as I was told. I went into the room, closed and locked the door, and walked over to the bed where Dot was clinging to Mother. "Will Daddy be all right?" Dot asked in a small, sad voice. "Of course he will," Mother said. I eased over to the window and looked outside. There, in the light of the full moon, I saw the tiny old woman who'd been here collecting for widows and orphans. "Mother, look." She extricated herself from Dot and came to the window. "What's she doing?" "Keeping watch, I imagine. I'm going—" Mother pointed her finger at me. "You'll stay here with your sister. I'll take care of that one." As soon as Mother left, I asked Dot, "What do you think?" "Get the ladder," she said. Nodding, I sneaked into the hallway, opened the closet, and retrieved the rope ladder. By the time I'd returned to Mother and Daddy's room, Dot had opened the window. I secured the ladder to the windowsill, and down I went. The woman didn't see me, and she gave a shriek when I tackled her. Lucky for her, there was snow on the ground to cushion her fall. Since she was down, I sat on her to make sure she wasn't going anywhere. Unlike me, Dot had the good sense to put on shoes before she climbed down the ladder. "I'm going for the police," she called as she raced down the street. The old lady started to scream again, so I shoved her face into the snow. "You hush," I said, "and you're giving back that money my daddy gave you for the widows and orphans." "I am a widow." Her words were muffled, but I could understand her. "But you're going to be an orphan when my son gets gone with your parents." I smashed her head more firmly into the ground and prayed Dot would return soon. And then there she was, our little rescuer, and with her was that gumshoe, and a bunch of other coppers. "That didn't take long," I said. "They were staking us out." She smiled like being surveilled was the greatest thing ever, and in that moment, I supposed it was. A uniformed officer helped me stand and then put handcuffs on the old lady. Another one picked me up saying I'd get frostbite on my feet if I wasn't careful, and I fell in love with that handsome young man then and there. He and the officer with the handcuffed old lady and Dot, who was wrapped in a charcoal gray blanket, hung back until the others went inside and rescued our parents. There wasn't a lot of rescue involved, however, because Mother had already brained the woman's son with her cast-iron skillet. I doubted he'd remember anything about this night when he woke up. And guess who he was? James Carter. Or rather, the man we'd been introduced to as James Carter. He wasn't our neighbor's son at all. Poor Mrs. Carter had been forced to go along with the ruse because his real mom, the old lady I'd tackled in the yard, had taken Mrs. Carter's beloved cat William and had threatened to kill him if Mrs. Carter didn't cooperate. My knight in shining uniform carried me into the house and deposited me on a chair by the fireplace. He took his gloves off to stoke the fire, and I spied a wedding ring. I was ever so heartbroken until I spotted another young officer on the other side of the room, who was absolutely the elephant's eyebrows. Hope springs eternal, as they say. Back to the present. "Was William all right?" Zoe asked. "How about the gun?" Amanda asked. "What happened to that?" William was fine and continued to poop in Mother's flower bed until he was almost 20 years old, I said. He outlived me, as a matter of fact. And the gun? Dave prompted. Oh, yeah. The boss went to jail for killing the other gangster and for ordering the murders of Freddie and Mavis. The other gangster? Dwight frowned. I thought you said the boss had killed a policeman. Yeah, well, I suppose it was. My nephew was smirking at me, and I swatted at him. Never mind that I couldn't touch him. That's an amazing story, Zoe said. It is, and all that talk of cookies and cocoa made me hungry. Amanda tried futilely to wipe the glitter off her hands. I'm going to wash up and make us some cocoa. Real cocoa like my great-grandmother used to make? Zoe asked. Yep. As Zoe and Amanda left the room, Dwight said, I'm surprised I never heard that story growing up, Aunt Max. Me too, I said. Dave tried unsuccessfully to smother a chuckle. Is it true? I grinned. To the best of my recollection, absolutely.
We hope you've enjoyed this production of Have Yourself a Scary Little Christmas by Gail Leeson. If you'd like to learn more about the Ghostly Fashionista series, please visit the author's website at gailleeson.com or visit the publisher at graceabrahampublishing.com. Thank you.